everyone. This is Susan Griffin. I'm Executive Director of National Council for the Social Studies, and I'm very pleased to have you all with us as we discuss the ESEA reauthorization and how it may affect social studies. First, I need to introduce you to Katrina McDonald, who's the president of Linchpin Strategies. She is the NCSS lobbyist, and she specializes in assisting private and not-for-profit clients in the areas of health, education, and disability to communicate their priorities and needs to all levels of government. Prior to founding Linchpin, she was a vice president for policy at the fastest growing public relations firm in the DC area. Her experience on Capitol Hill includes working for Senator Edward Kennedy on the Senate Labor Committee, staffing domestic social issues and appropriations for Congressman Steny Hoyer, the current minority whip, and serving as a legislative director for Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro. She received her Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University and a Master's in Public Policy from Harvard University Kennedy School of Government. So you see, we are in very good hands, but most significant to NCSS, Katrina has guided our organization in crafting our policy messages and to be the most effective advocates we can possibly be on behalf of social studies. Kat, would you like to begin?
Susan, thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for joining us. It is a hot and sticky summer afternoon here in Washington, D.C., and I imagine it is hot and sticky wherever you are as well, but there is a lot going on, a lot that we have been working for years. It's exciting to see the not quite final culmination, but we're really getting there, of a huge amount of work that has been done across the states by many of you and by those of us here in DC. And we want to talk about pushing all of this good stuff across the finish line. So without any further ado, let's talk about where this ESEA reauthorization is now and what is going to be next for the states. So we've been working on Elementary and Secondary Education Act reauthorization attempts for more than 10 years. I was looking at my NCSS file, and I have a 2011 reauthorization file, and a 2013 reauthorization file, and a 2015 reauthorization file. And this legislation is actually moving. It's not guaranteed yet that the House and Senate will come up with something that the president will sign, but this is the most likely attempt that we have seen since the creation of No Child Left Behind. And so if there's anybody on this webinar or anybody in your council or anybody in your state who is saying, we don't have to pay much attention to this because this is going to poop out just like all of the prior attempts, please let them know. This is real, this is happening, and while it's not a done deal, it has the best chance of any effort to actually make it to the president's desk and be signed and change the way that social studies and other K-12 education programs are run in your states and in your schools. So let's talk about what's in the legislation right now. The House passed H.R. 5, which is its legislation, a couple of weeks ago. You may remember that they had put it on the House floor earlier in the spring. There was a conservative revolt, and they had to pull it off the floor. But when it looked like the Senate was really moving out to pass its legislation, the House pulled itself together, put its bill back on the floor, and actually passed it. The theme of this legislation is very much return of power to the states. The legislation can fairly be described as a reaction against the shift of education policy control to Washington, D.C., and particularly to the Department of Education and the Secretary of Education, who, as you know, has been issuing waivers during the stalemate over how to update No Child Left Behind. This legislation in the House returns to states the ability to define state standards in all areas of, in all fields and all subjects, and contains a number of other provisions, some of which are very controversial. Civil rights communities are deeply concerned about accountability for subgroups of populations. Um, there are a lot of folks who have concerns about what is in this bill. For our purposes, the most concerning thing about this legislation is that there's no mention of the social studies in the bill, and there are no programs that would explicitly fund civics, history, economics, or geography. Similar to current law, there are large-ish pots of money that states control, and states can choose to invest the funding in improving the teaching of the social studies, supporting the teaching of the social studies. But as we know, when subjects are not tested, they're often not taught, and they certainly aren't supported with state funding. So there is no mention of social studies in the House-passed bill, and no funding that is dedicated for that purpose, which is why it is really, really exciting to take a look at what's in the Senate-passed bill. The Senate bill was 1177, and it too continues the theme of the return of power to states, but it's got sort of more guardrails. It is nowhere near as prescriptive as No Child Left Behind, but it doesn't go quite as far as the House legislation. We will spend most of our time talking today about 4 vital provisions for history, civics, geography, and economics. It is really, really exciting that for the first time since funding went away for programs that support the teaching of the social studies almost 5 years ago now, there is an actual opportunity to receive dedicated funding for the social studies. And we will spend most of our time talking about those programs, what they would do, and what we need to do as a community to make sure that those provisions stay in the bill until it is signed into law. I think it is important to note, before we talk about the details of these programs, Chairman Klein, the chairman of the House bill, has made it clear that he is not excited about many of the dedicated programs that are included in the Senate bill. As I said, social studies has 3 programs plus another provision for financial literacy, but we're not the only ones. And the Senate has created many new programs that did not exist under current law. And I have been told that it is the #1 objective of House conservatives to get the maximum number of new and existing programs out of the legislation. So we have come a really long way in the Senate bill, but we cannot rest on our laurels. It is important for folks to understand that we have an uphill battle in the negotiation between the Senate and the House, and we need to work very, very hard to support the Senate position and to make sure that when the House and Senate finish their negotiation, our social studies provisions are not left on the cutting room floor. So let's talk a little bit about those programs and what's in them and why it's important. So there is a section of the legislation, Section 2300, that creates a couple of programs related to history, civics, economics, and geography. The purpose of this section is stated as being 2 things: to improve the quality of American history, civics, and government education by educating students about the history and principles of the Constitution of the United States, And two, to improve the quality of teaching of American history, civics, and government in elementary and secondary schools, including the teaching of what Senate Chairman Alexander describes as traditional American history. So there are three types of competitive grants in this section. The first and largest pot of money is for local education agencies. So one of the things that's important to remember about this is not mandatory money. This is not money that automatically flows to states and states have to use it for teaching social studies. This is a competitive grant, and local education agencies would be the lead in applying for it. The grants would be used to promote the teaching of traditional American history as a separate academic subject and not a component of social studies, including developing programs, professional development, and teacher education. And a number of people have raised questions with us about why these provisions? Why is this limited to quote unquote traditional American history? Why is American history being pulled out of social studies? Why is world history or the history of other parts of the world not included in this? These are the priorities of Chairman Alexander of Tennessee. NCSS did not participate in writing this language. While we welcome the support for teaching American history, if NCSS had written this language, it would probably be written rather differently. However, we are delighted by this progress and have certainly communicated to Chairman Alexander that we are grateful for his support for instruction in American history. As part of the competition for these grants, the LEAs must partner with an institution of higher education or a nonprofit history or humanities organization, a library or museum, or some entity that has a relevant history expertise. The longest time period that an LEA can apply for is 5 years, and this would receive a minimum of 85% of however much money would be appropriated for this section. That's a little bit vague, and I recognize that. We do not yet know how much money the Appropriations Committee would choose to allocate to this section of the law if this were written into law. And those of you who have participated in these webinars and conversations before would know that if we secure this in authorization language, the next thing we'll be doing next year is working to get the highest possible appropriation. Until the Congress both finishes creating these programs and then decides how much to fund them, I can't answer the question about how much money would be in this category, but it would, whatever is appropriated, 85% of that money would be made available to local education agencies. The second sort of category of competitive funding that was created in this bill is presidential and congressional academies. The presidential academies are intended for intensive professional development opportunities for teachers in American history and civics. Entities with demonstrated expertise in teaching of American history and civics, historical methodology, would be able to apply, and they could be awarded funding to run summer seminars or institutes. Those intensive training opportunities for teachers would need to be at least 2 weeks long. Each academy could enroll between 50 and 300 teachers, and teachers would receive a stipend to attend the training in addition to receiving money to run the institute. And a parallel program to the presidential academies, there would also be grants awarded for congressional academies. And these congressional academies are also summer experiences, intensive instruction in American history and civics for students, um, rising high school sophomores or juniors. And again, the applicants would be entities with demonstrated expertise in historical methodology or the teaching of American history or civics, or a consortium of such organizations. The summer seminars or institutes would be about 2 weeks, at least 2 weeks in duration. And for the combination of presidential or teacher academies and congressional or student academies, there would be up to 12 grants awarded. And it does not specify half of them have to be presidential academies and half have to be congressional academies. There's a little bit of flexibility for the Department of Education to fund high quality applications, but up to 12 grants would be awarded, and these two academies would get up to 10% of the appropriation, whatever that is. The third category of grants is parallel to the Sandra Day O'Connor Act that has been introduced over the course of the last couple of years in the House of Representatives. And these are grants to nonprofit organizations to promote innovative strategies enhancing instruction in history, civics, and geography, with a focus on underserved students. That does not mean, with some changes in the language, that all of the grants would be for nonprofits that are focused on underserved students, but it is certainly an intent of the language that underserved students' needs be met by some of the development of innovative approaches here. These grants would be awarded to develop, implement, and disseminate both new and existing approaches to teaching civics, American history, and geography, including professional development. Unlike the prior grants, these are maximum 3-year grants, and this is the smallest portion of the money, a maximum of 5% of appropriations. In addition to those 3 competitive grants for history, civics, and geography, Senator Peters of Michigan offered an amendment that made financial literacy initiatives an eligible use for local education agency parent engagement funds. So, unlike the history and civics and geography activities, which are competitive grants, when LEAs get their formula distribution of funding, a small percentage of it is set aside for parent engagement activities. And there's a list of activities that qualify under parent engagement, and financial literacy is one of those eligible activities. So the funding for the economics aspect of this, the financial literacy aspect of this, works differently from the history, civics, and geography. History, civics, and geography is a competitive grant process, and the financial literacy activities are an eligible use of formula funds that will be received by LEAs. In addition, there was an amendment that was drafted by Senator Donnelly to add economics to the nonprofit competitive grants. That was not offered during Senate debate. I think that there was some concern that the nonprofit grants was a very small pot of money, 5% of the overall appropriation, and that the sponsors of that grant were a little concerned about stretching the money further. Um, Senator Donnelly's office, for whatever reason and based on whatever feedback they got, decided not to offer the amendment in the Senate debate, but they are interested in thinking about how to insert additional opportunities for economics instruction in this overall ESEA reauthorization effort, and we are continuing to work with that office in conversations. So where do things go from here? What is next for this legislation? Um, Typically, what will happen is that Congress goes out of session and everybody goes home, and members of Congress are working and perhaps getting a little bit of a break with their families, and staff have an opportunity to uh, go on vacation. But that's not going to happen here. Um, I'm sorry, I'm seeing a quick question. What state is Senator Donnelly from? And he is the junior senator from Indiana. Um, my chat box is going back and forth between private and public chats. So if I miss a question, Susan and the NCSS staff are going to help make sure that I don't overlook you and get too far into the presentation without responding to questions that you've asked.
I do have a
Mhm.
question about why they need to go through LEAs instead of at the state level. Do you have the background on that?
So typically, when you are looking at um, a program that is going to be impacting school districts or implemented at the school district level, the thinking is that it should be an LEA competition instead of a state competition. Um, with Race to the Top and some of the other Obama administration initiatives, they deviated from that, obviously. Um, Nobody has said this to me directly. I suspect that one of the reasons that the Republican authors of this provision wrote it this way and had it as an LEA competition instead of an SEA competition is to make it look as little as possible like the Obama administration's Race to the Top grants, which went to states. But if we asked them for sort of what they would say publicly as opposed to what they might say privately behind closed doors, I think that they would say the LEA is the competitive entity that is closest to the students and the community and most in touch with the needs of the students and the community. And that's why it is appropriate to have the competition at the LEA level. Um, I think it also looks less like a mandate if the competition is held at the local level rather than the state level. Any other questions that I might not have caught up with? Thank you, Susan. All right, so let's talk about where things go from here. Um, as I was saying, typically August is a quiet month for people to take a breather and catch up. That is not going to happen this year. Staff will begin negotiations imminently, and through the month of August, they will be identifying issues that are going to have to be negotiated at the member level and trying to reach negotiation on things that are smaller that might be able to be agreed to and settled by staff so that when members come back in the fall, the number of things that they have to grapple with is minimized. It is a little difficult to predict whether our programs and issues for the social studies will rise to the level of member attention. I think it is very possible that this will be part of a staff discussion, and that the language might be massaged and refined a little bit by staff conversations. But as I said, it's a very high priority for House conservatives to reduce the number of new programs being created and even get the number of existing programs down, if at all possible. And so, in that context, um, we may, by virtue of being new programs, also end up in a member level negotiation in the fall. And that's why it is so important to make sure that we are clearly defending these programs and demonstrating the strongest possible support for the Senate provisions. If we think back to our own civics and American government classes, which I know some of you teach, now that the bill has passed the House and the Senate, conferees will be appointed. They represent the House Education and Workforce Committee membership and the Senate Help Committee membership. We don't yet know which members of those committees, maybe all of the members of those committees, will be appointed as conferees. Certainly, the chairman and ranking member of the House and Senate committees will be on the conference, and they will sit down probably in September and negotiate the outstanding issues that need to be settled. Once a compromise bill has been negotiated between the House and Senate, with some White House input, the administration becomes the third leg of this triangular stool negotiation, because the House and Senate are not just trying to negotiate something that can pass both chambers, but trying to negotiate something that can be signed into law. So they'll probably spend most of September, perhaps into October, maybe longer than that, finalizing a compromise bill, passing it through the House and Senate, and sending it to the president. And the timing for that is a little uncertain. So knowing that that is the process and that we have an uncertain timeline, what can we be doing to make a difference? So obviously we want to continue to reinforce our support in the Senate, but the most important work that we need to do is in the House. And we will shortly be circulating a Dear Colleague letter to be sent to all members of the House of Representatives by between 4 and 6 members of Congress who support the social studies. And this Dear Colleague letter will express support of members of the House of Representatives for the Senate social studies provisions, and ask other members of the House of Representatives to sign on. We're identifying those lead sponsors now, and once we have that list finalized, those members and their staff will circulate the letter to their colleagues, and we will want to reinforce with representatives that we need their help and want their signature on this letter. And so this is going to be a little bit of an uphill battle. It will be August. A lot of people at home will be checked out on vacation, and a lot of staff in DC will be checking out for a week or two to be on vacation. But we know that this is going to be an active topic of discussion, and we can't wait until everybody comes back to school and work in September to move this letter forward. So we hope to finalize this letter by next week. As soon as it is finalized and sent around to representatives' offices, we will be sending it with action alerts to you and asking you to contact your members of Congress, your representatives, and urge them to sign the letter. So as soon as we get that finalized, it will be heading your way. There will be action alerts popping up in your inbox, and we expect that you can be looking for those next week. I'm going to pause there because I see there's been a lot of activity on the chat, and it's hard for me to keep up with the questions when I'm walking through the bullet points. I think I addressed some of the questions about the timing, and I'm wondering if there are other questions that folks either have asked that I missed or would like to ask.
Kat, there's a question about the other content areas that had been left out before, like the arts, PE, health. Are they being addressed as well?
So there are provisions for the arts. I am less clear about PE. I believe that there's also some provisions for foreign language. I confess I have not been following those as closely as the social studies provisions for obvious reasons. When I say that there are provisions in the bill for them, I'm talking about the Senate legislation. They, like we, are left out of the House legislation. And I will also note that in the full committee markup in the Senate, Senator Casey offered what he called a well-rounded education amendment, that instead of supporting aspects of the well-rounded education like social studies and foreign language and the arts in competitive grants, had his amendment passed, it would have um, provided formula funding to states to be passed on to LEAs and schools to support instruction in all of those areas. That amendment failed by one vote in the Help Committee, and Senator Casey decided not to offer it on the floor. In talking to Casey's office and some of the other subjects that are also not funded through formula funding, and looking at the politics of conference, I think it is unlikely that a well-rounded education amendment of the type that Senator Casey offered, and that I think most of us on this phone call would probably like to see, funding that's provided through a formula and guaranteed to all LEAs as opposed to competitive grants. Um, I think most of us would support that, and I don't think that Senator Casey or his allies see a clear path to including that in conference. I think he hasn't completely given up, but I don't think that the odds of inserting that in conference at this point are very strong. Excellent question, though. Any other questions?
Now, someone's
Yes.
asking.
So Stephanie's observing that we're in support of these provisions because they are our only option for social science. And yes, I would absolutely agree. Um, and even going back to the questions asked by the world history folks about the focus on American history, and in a perfect world, we might have written these provisions differently. We are delighted to have gotten this far. This represents huge progress. Really, at some points in the last 5 years, I would have said that this is unimaginable progress. And so we want to support it as strongly as we possibly can. As I mentioned, the first priority is to reach out to the House of Representatives, and we want as many representatives as possible to sign on to this Dear Colleague letter and support the Senate provisions. If you are an overachiever and you are a part of a council in a state that is on the Senate Help Committee, it is also useful to be in touch with your senator on the Help Committee to ask him or her in conference to support the social studies provisions. And I have listed in this slide the states that are represented on the Help Committee. If you have a Help Committee member, I hope that you know who those senators are. And if you don't know who those senators are on the Help Committee, please let me know, because I would be delighted to help you figure that out and to help you get in touch with that person. Um, I think that there has been a question about sort of the internal school politics of advocating and contacting representatives and senators. And we've done actually several webinars that are archived on the NCSS website about advocacy and what NCSS members can do in their roles as private citizens, and what you can do or may be restricted from doing in the name of your organization, whether you are a social studies coordinator, whether you are a a teacher. So I would only say, in the context of this webinar, and again, if you need more detailed guidance on this, please reach out individually. Most NCSS members should be able to do things like send an email through Voter Voice in your capacity as an engaged citizen and a constituent, and not speaking on behalf of your school or your school district or your state. There may be some people who, after talking with others in your organization, can use your organizational credentials to talk about this. You should certainly check with folks. We don't want you to be doing any outreach that gets you into trouble. And where you cannot use your school or other organizational platform, your local council may be the best platform for you. And certainly, as you're talking or writing or emailing with congressional offices, you can say, I know about what's going on in the teaching of social studies in our state because I'm a social studies teacher or because I'm a social studies coordinator. And you can be clear, I'm speaking on my own behalf as a private citizen and individual. I'm not speaking on behalf of my organization. But you can let them know the reason you care about this and the reason that you are an expert on what's going on in your area is because of your background here. Any other questions? Again, I don't want to belabor this, and we have spent time on other NCSS webinars talking about what you can and can't do and what is lobbying, and if you are not allowed to lobby, how you can provide information and education as opposed to advocating. So all of that is archived on the website. But is there anything else that we should cover briefly here before we move on? I see as part of the chat that Chad has put in the link to the help committee. Thank you so much. So if you are in one of the states listed and you don't know which member of your delegation is a member of the help committee, you can go to www.help.senate.gov and look that up. Chad is also reminding us that August 10th is going to be an opportunity to advocate for the social studies through a tweet chat. And I am looking forward to participating in that. I hope many of you are as well. And I know that if you are hearing about this for the first time, that Chad will be providing additional information. So one last point that is related to what we've been talking about, it's a little longer term, it's not as imminent, but always good to have a heads up so that you can be thinking forward. If this legislation passes, and as I said at the outset, this is the bill that is the most likely to have legs, but it is not a slam dunk, to mix a metaphor. States will be required to have what are described in the Senate bill as challenging academic standards for all students. Many of your states have just gone in the last couple of years through a process of establishing state standards in the various academic disciplines that meet the No Child Left Behind criteria. If this legislation passes, states are going to have an opportunity, it is not a mandate, but it is an opportunity to revisit their state standards. And they could decide to change the state standards if they don't care for or have issues with the standards that they were required to adopt to be consistent with the requirements of No Child Left Behind. If the provisions in the Senate bill hold, the Secretary of Education will be prohibited from mandating, supervising, establishing, approving, or exercising any direction over any criteria regarding academic standards that are established or adopted by states. So states will have pretty free rein to establish what they consider to be challenging academic standards. We put this on your radar screen. You may be in a state where they do not open or reopen questions of state social studies standards, but you might be in a state where they decide to move forward with a process of re-examining or establishing new standards for the social studies. And if that happens, obviously, you and your councils will want to be engaged in that conversation and weighing in on those standards. But that is much further down the road. And the imminent issue that we all need to be prepared to weigh in on is to garner the highest possible level of support from the maximum number of members of the House of Representatives in support for the 4 social studies related provisions that are in the Senate bill. As I said, we hope to finalize the lead sponsors of the Dear Colleague by the middle of next week, maybe the end of next week. And as soon as that letter goes out from those sponsors to their colleagues, we will be emailing, pinging, calling, pleading, begging, banging drums, sending up smoke signals, and asking you to please contact your representatives so that they can sign that Dear Colleague letter. Let's pause there for just a moment. Are there any questions about how reaching out to the representatives in your state should work? Who can do that? Who should do that? How to do that? The best way to communicate? And how do we get this on congressional offices' radar screens in August so we can get the maximum number of signatures by the end of the month and support these social studies provisions? Does anybody have any questions about that process and how we can be as effective as possible? I see that a few folks are typing, and I'm going to pause for a minute. So Chad is asking, is contacting the education liaison in the office the best way to weigh in? So the person who is going to be making the recommendation to the member of Congress will be the education legislative assistant in Washington, D.C. And typically those will be that will be the best staff person to contact. If you don't know the education legislative assistant, but you or someone on your council has a relationship with a district staffer, maybe a district staffer who came out and spoke to a social studies class, maybe a district staffer who is aware of the work that you did with a Teach American History grant or other programs. If you have a relationship with somebody in the district office, it's always good to talk to somebody in the context of a relationship. But if you are going to be contacting someone you don't know, the education legislative assistant in the DC office is the person who will be handling this for the representative. And if you talk to somebody in the district office, you want to make sure that they are connecting to, talking with, and answering the questions that the DC legislative assistant might have. We will send you through Voter Voice a sample email to send to the congressional office, and you can personalize that with additional information about what is happening with social studies in your state or your area. So we're going to make this as easy as possible. One question was asked, what is the best way to appeal to conservative Republicans? And how do you make an argument to conservative Republicans to persuade them to support the social studies provisions? I think you are the best judge, because all conservatives are not created equal. Congressman Tom Cole of Oklahoma is, by any measure, a conservative Republican, but he supports the teaching of social studies and American history. So I'm going to give you a couple of suggestions, but ultimately, there's no one size fits all answer for conservatives, just like there's no one size fits all answer for teaching civics and government and geography and economics to students across the country. So the arguments that I have found are most effective. First of all, this is not a mandate. These are competitive grants, and they are designed to support and enhance the teaching of the social studies for schools and school districts that want and need to improve their instruction. This is not being dictated from Washington. This is not even being dictated from the state capitol. So an advantage, there was a question about why these go to LEAs and not states. And one advantage of that, having the grants go to LEAs and to nonprofits, this is not a mandate. So this is something to support LEAs, schools, and school districts. I have found that giving examples, and the more extreme the example, the better, frankly, can be very compelling. So a lot of people in Washington sit here and they have these big picture ideas like, well, states have money and they can choose to spend it on the social studies, on government, on civics, on economics, and nobody should be telling them what to do, but this is a democracy. Everybody knows it's important to teach American history. Everybody knows it's important to teach government. So they're doing that, right? And when I tell them real world examples that I have heard, such as at Summer Leadership Institute from teachers across the country about how this is not happening, it is astonishing. And they're floored. So, for example, when I tell them that a teacher from Arizona told us that students in her school could meet their middle school government and civics requirement by volunteering to answer phones and file papers in the school office, conservative members of Congress and their staff in Washington don't think that that's right. When we tell members of the Iowa delegation that in a survey of Iowa teachers, fewer than 50% had even been offered one single professional development opportunity in the social studies in the prior 2 years, they think that's wrong. So a teacher at Summer Leadership Institute this year told us that in her elementary school, students are being offered 15 minutes of social studies every other day. When congressional offices hear the actual facts and the real world examples, all of a sudden they get more prescriptive. So I hope that that helps. Having facts and figures, having local examples, I think can be very powerful. And when I tell folks that on the NAEP test, fewer than 25% of eighth graders were able to identify the purpose of the Bill of Rights, and it's actually in the title of the document, they begin to understand the scope of the problem. And people who say, oh, well, we should just leave it to the states or the locals, start to think that maybe they ought to get a little more prescriptive. But again, this is not a mandate. These are competitive grants, and we are supporting schools and school districts, teachers who need the help. We are not requiring them to do anything. So I know that there's been quite a lot of activity on the chat, and again, it's hard for me to follow all of it when I am speaking. So are there other questions that folks need to have addressed in the remaining 10 minutes on the webinar? I have to say, I love this chat because there's so much great knowledge in this community, and it makes me feel like I don't always have to be the one who answers every question. There are terrific suggestions coming in from others on the webinar, and really sometimes when I do these webinars, I feel like there are a dozen people on the webinar who could be offering this um, just as well as I am. So thank you for the team approach. I love being part of a posse.
Yes, and we love having a fearless leader to guide us.
Well, you're very kind.
It looks like some people are still typing like mad. Um, just make sure that we're attentive to the time. We have about 9 minutes left.
So I know there are a lot of folks who are excited about getting this letter. I'm excited to get it finalized and out to you, and we will keep you posted. It will not be before Wednesday of next week, but we hope to get it out to you as quickly as possible afterwards.
And we will need you to take informed action.
Yes, absolutely. And, questions about, so who could do this? Like, if you're using voter voice, you know, forward those messages to your friends, your neighbors, your family members, any constituent can send off a quick email to a member of Congress saying, I'm a voter in your district. I care about instruction in the social studies, and please support the teaching of the social studies by supporting the provisions in the Senate legislation. One other um, note, about talking to conservatives. I never, ever, ever use the term social studies when I am talking to a conservative office. I talk about civics, I talk about history, I talk about government, I talk about geography, I talk about economics. Um, I always lead with history and civics because, frankly, those are the two subject areas that the most conservative members care the most about. Um, for better or worse, many, not all, but many care less about economics and geography than they do about um, civics and history. But I never use the words social studies because, in my experience with conservative members of Congress and conservative staff, it always takes me to a place that I don't really want to be. So there's a question about voter voice, which is the email system that NCSS uses to get action alerts related to legislation out to NCSS members. If you have not registered to receive voter voice action alerts, um, Susan or Tim, do you have the information about how to register to be on that list so that when NCSS sends out its voter voice alerts, if there are people on this call who are not getting those alerts, they can make sure that it'll pop up in their inbox next week?
We are finding that information out as I am speaking. And Peggy, I will make sure you get it.
And Chad Taylor has just put https://votervoice, all one word, .net/NCSS/home.
Yay, Chad!
Like I said, I love having a posse.
And we are taping this as well. So once it is edited, you'll be able to go back and listen to it.
Or
And
if
we
there
will
are others
share
from
the
your council who
PowerPoint.
didn't, yeah, who didn't get to participate, because they were on vacation or they had other commitments during this time frame. Um, to the extent that there is information that's helpful, please encourage others if they need to listen later.
Any other questions before we're wrapping up? I think Kat has really made a good point. If you're in a situation where you don't feel comfortable doing this because of your principal looking over your shoulder, which is kind of remarkable yet, I know you have family members and colleagues who may be in a position to do so, and just reach out to them. Anything else? I think you're getting now all these Cat's the best. You're wonderful. Thank heavens we have you. That kind of stuff.
My favorite is Mary just registered for voter voice. Go, Mary. That's awesome.
Yay!
Well, thank you all very much. We appreciate your spending some time on a summer afternoon when you could have been doing a long list of other things. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for the work that you have done, and thank you for the work that you are going to do, maybe even as early as next week.
Thank you so much, Kat. We really appreciate your help, your thoughtful guidance, and your urging us to do what social studies teachers should be doing. Thanks so much. And we're waiting at our mailboxes and our email boxes for this dear colleague letter.